Hello and welcome to Lamplighter. Today is November 2. Today in our daily Bible reading, we continue to journey with Jesus throughout the paths of his ministry while he is here on earth. And there are a number of miracles that are being performed that we have already seen. There are a number of great teachings that have already been taught. There are a number of great parables that have been spoken. And Jesus is still at a point where people are curious about him. We saw in yesterday's reading he had probably reached the peak of his popularity when he fed 5,000 men, plus women and children, with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fish. But shortly after that, we saw his popularity begin to wane because he started teaching some very difficult teachings. People want to follow kind of a folk hero as long as he is doing miraculous things and causing their curiosity to be intensified. But when Jesus starts making demands about the cost of discipleship, when he starts saying that in order to follow him, it's going to require some sacrifice and even some suffering, people are not so interested anymore. So in today's reading, as we pick up the reading, we start noticing that Jesus is going to go to a different area, maybe one that the Jewish people, especially the most religious of the Jews, would be a little bit surprised by. We notice in the gray section, in the commentary section of our reading today, that Jesus turns his ministry now to Phoenicia and the area around Tyre and Sidon. These are the Canaanite people, and the Canaanites are looked down upon by the Jews as being unworthy of God's blessings, primarily because of their heritage. It is an excellent opportunity here for Jesus to teach his disciples once again about the universality of his kingdom. Jesus is making it very clear by the way he performs his ministry that this message, this coming kingdom, is going to be an inclusive kingdom. So we start today's reading with the plea of a Canaanite woman. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is suffering terribly from demon possession." And he answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." The woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. He replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and take it and throw it to their dogs." "Yes, Lord," she said, "but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted," and her daughter was healed from that very hour. It's an interesting interchange because at first Jesus makes it clear that his message is not to the Canaanites, but to the lost sheep of Israel, the Israelites. But when this woman persists, he starts to speak to her in figurative language, and he says it's not right to take the food and give it to those who don't sit at the table with us. And she says, yes, follows the language completely, understands the figurative nature of it. And she says, yes, but even the dogs, don't they get the crumbs that fall from the table? And he's so impressed not only by her persistence, not only by her faith, but when Mark tells the story, he's even impressed by what she says. Why? Because he's speaking in in-depth language. He's speaking in figurative language, and she understands. Jesus blesses her as a result and grants healing to her daughter. We then read that Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged him to place his hand on the man. And he took him aside away from the crowd. Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, "Ephphatha," which means, "be opened." At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Now, what's fascinating to me about this healing, Jesus had healed other deaf people before. He had healed other mute people before. But in this case, Jesus takes this man away from the crowd. He looks up to heaven. But before healing him, did you notice this? He looks up to heaven and sighs. What does that sigh mean? Have you ever seen or heard in our readings Jesus sigh before? That always intrigues me. What made him sigh? Why would Jesus go? I think that sigh communicates as he looks at this man who's deaf and mute. This is not the way it's supposed to be. This is not the kind of life he's supposed to live. And then Jesus heals him. In so many ways, even spiritually for us today, don't you know and don't you believe that sometimes we find ourselves in such difficult situations and such positions of heartbreak and hard times that don't you know there are times when Jesus just looks up to heaven and this is not the way it's supposed to be. And then he leads us toward a better answer, toward a better life. Shortly after this encounter, we read about the feeding of 4,000 people. Now, this is a different encounter because the number is different. There are 4,000 that are fed, 4,000 men, that is. We also read that in this case, there are 7 loaves of bread and a few fish. There are 7 baskets of fragments taken up. But what's fascinating is the scene is almost identical, where the crowd has followed Jesus and Jesus says, "Where are we going to get food?" And the disciples are questioning where that food might come from. Weren't they there when he fed the 5,000? Don't they know that Jesus is capable of taking care of the needs of this multitude? And yet even the disciples seem a little bit slow on the uptake. It is at this point that the Pharisees, if you can believe it, start asking for a sign. And you have to wonder, where have they been? Jesus has performed a number of signs. Jesus says to them when they ask for a sign, you know how to interpret the appearance of the sky. You know how to tell the weather, basically, from looking at the clouds. But you cannot interpret the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation, Jesus says, looks for a miraculous sign, but none will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. Now, this seems an odd thing to say. Why is Jesus talking about Jonah when the Pharisees are asking him for a sign? The sign of Jonah we read in other places, Jesus explains in a little bit more detail. He says, just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, the Son of Man is going to be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. Jesus is predicting here his own death, his own burial, and after 3 days, his own resurrection. But the Pharisees don't see it. The common people don't see it. He continues to teach. He continues to speak in figurative language. He continues to heal, and yet so few people so far are even getting it. Jesus starts to warn his disciples about the Pharisees and the other leaders of the people religiously, and he uses language, again figuratively, to say, be careful of or watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees, or in some translations, the leaven of the Pharisees. And when he talks about yeast or leaven, the disciples are confused. They think he's scolding them on this occasion because they don't have bread with them. And Jesus gets a little frustrated here, and he says, why would you think that I'm talking about bread? He reminds them, we had a gathering of 5,000 men plus women and children, and I fed them with 5 loaves of fish and 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. We had a gathering later of 4,000 men plus women and children, and I fed them with 7 loaves of bread and a few fish. And in both cases, you had more than enough and had basketfuls of fragments remaining. Do you think I'm really talking about bread? You can almost hear Jesus' frustration. And finally, the disciples get it. Finally, they understand he's not talking about physical bread. He's telling them to be careful about the teachings of the Pharisees and the religious leaders, and how their teachings tend to permeate and spread throughout the crowds of people and take root. Then at the close of today's reading, Jesus heals another blind man near Bethsaida, once again to show the power of God and his authority to wield that power. Isn't it great to be a lamplighter? His word is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. I hope you have a blessed day.